I'm Umi and welcome back to my Pink Pantheress dress-up game series. If you're new here, hello, nice to meet you. And if you're a subscriber or a frequent viewer, hey, it's good to see you again. If you haven't seen the previous videos, definitely check those out first through the playlist. They'll give this episode some context. Episode 8 and 9 is also another double episode. Since episode 9 involves with the finished scene and the main menu, I combined it once again, so please enjoy. In this episode, I worked on the main menu for the game. Up until now, the game opened straight into the wardrobe scene, so I needed a proper starting point. Something simple, clean and consistent with the rest of the UI. Before I get to the actual menu setup, there's something I probably should have mentioned earlier, maybe back in episode 2, but it fits better here since this episode is focused on the main menu. A little while ago, I created a draft version for the menu screen using Canva. I wanted to experiment with the layout, colors, and the text first so I could get a feel for the overall vibe before building it properly in Godot engine. From the menu layout, I took inspiration from designs I saw on Pinterest as well as video games I played growing up, especially Nintendo DS games. I really love how cute and colourful their interfaces are, so I thought that style would work perfectly for this dress-up game. While designing the logo, I originally planned to use Dino Puff font because I thought it would fit the aesthetic, but after testing it, it didn't look quite right. Instead, I switched it to the font Kawaii RT Shine, which matched the vibe much better. To make the logo feel more unique, I added small star details to the lettering along with the subtle half tone and the shaded background behind the logo. I also added a diamond pattern background because it works really well with the cute retro game aesthetic. After experimenting with different palettes and elements, I finally came up with the layout I liked. Once the draft was finished, I downloaded all the elements as a transparent PNGs so I could edit them further. My Canva free trial had actually expired around that time and I didn't have enough money to keep using it, so I made sure to export everything before the trial ended. Then I brought the assets into Clip Studio Paint to adjust the color scene so it matched the rest of the game aesthetic. I also replaced the placeholder Pink Panther sprite that I used in Canva draft. While I was still in Canva, I even created some simple transitions and animations as a reference of how I wanted the menu to feel in the game. Later on, I updated the design again because the original version felt a bit flat and needed something to help it pop more. I also changed the title of the game to make it more original and avoid confusion since this project is only fan inspired. Once everything looked right, I imported the final assets into Godot and built the menu scene. I might change the Pink Panther sprite later on. Using the same sprite everywhere can start to feel a bit repetitive, but for now this version works well. I created a new scene for the main menu. I added the basic UI elements, a title, a start button, a sound button, and a background. Some of the UI elements weren't aligned correctly at first. The spacing and padding was slightly off, so I had to adjust the margins and anchors a few times to get everything centered. I added a hover and click animations to the buttons to make the menu feel responsive. Then I connected the start button so it loads the main game scene. Some of the button signals weren't firing. This happened because I had renamed some of the nodes earlier and the signals were still pointing to the old paths. I had to rebind everything manually in the editor.
I forgot to include this part during recording, so I've added it here using text-to-speech. I connected the start button to the main game scene. This was the first time the menu actually led into gameplay, and it made the whole project feel a lot more real. The scene loaded correctly, but the transition felt really abrupt at first. I knew I wanted the game to feel smoother, but I didn't want to get stuck on polishing too early, so I decided to leave the transition for later and focus on finishing the rest of the menu first.
I added a simple hover and click sound effects from the sites like Pixel Bay to the buttons. This helped the UI to feel more polished. A few sound effects didn't play at first because the auto stream player nodes weren't inside the scene tree when the button was pressed. I fixed this by reorganizing the nodes and using deferred calls. I tested the music for the first time here. It wasn't fully set up yet, but this was the beginning of the audio system. The background music I used at the time was Nice to Meet You by Pink Panthers for the menu section, and Tonight by Pink Panthers for the main game section. The mute button didn't sync across scenes. Sometimes the icon says mute while the music was still playing. This happens because each scene had its own copy of the mute button. I fixed it by using the global signal from the music manager so every mute button updates at the same time.
I once again forgot to include this part in the video. I didn't realize how much I'd done until I started documenting everything during editing. While I was polishing the main menu, I also added a scrolling background, kind of like the effect I usually do in Canva, just to make the scene feel a bit more alive. It's basically a looping texture that moves horizontally, and even though it's really simple, it adds a nice sense of motion so the menu doesn't look completely static. I did have to tweak the offset a few times to get the loop looking smooth and aligned. It took a little while, but once it finally worked, it made a surprisingly big difference in how the menu feels. I also made the character sprite slide into the menu when the scene loads. This part was actually really quick to set up, just a simple tween from off-screen into place, but it makes the menu feel way more dynamic. It's a small detail, but it adds a lot of personality to the intro.
I added a fade transition between the menu and the game scene. This made switching scenes smoother and more intentional. The fade overlay sometimes appeared behind the UI instead on top. I had to move the fade node into its own dedicated UI layer so it always renders above everything. The next scene sometimes loaded before the fade animation finished. I fixed this by adding tween callbacks so the scene only loads after the fade out completes. With the layout, button, sound and transition in place, the game now has a proper starting screen. And that's everything for this episode. With the main menu UI design completed and implemented, I am one step closer towards a finished game. In part 9, I will be working on a finished scene which completes the game loop. In this episode, I worked on the finished scene, the final part of the game where the player gets to see their completed outfit. This is also the episode when the game fully becomes a full loop for the first time, which was honestly a surreal moment. I started by transferring the finished scene UI assets I designed back in episode 2 into a brand new scene in Godot. Once everything was imported, I began placing the elements carefully so they aligned with the main game existing UI. Things like the sound button, the folder tabs, the background, and the overall spacing. For the actual outfit preview, I left the character sprite and the sprite tab centered in their own dedicated area. I wanted that space to feel clean, cute, and consistent with the rest of the UI. Nothing too busy, just a simple layout where the final outfit could really shine. The preview area didn't scale correctly at first. The sprite looked slightly stretched, so I had to adjust the container settings and the anchors to keep everything crisp. To display the outfit clearly, I used Sub-Viewport. This let me render the character and all the clothing layers separately from the UI, so the final preview looks sharp and consistent. The Sub-Viewport was initially rendering at the wrong resolution. It looked blurry until I changed the size setting and enabled Render Target Clear mode so the background stayed transparent. I added 2 buttons under the outfit preview, a save button and a share button. These are simple for now, they don't export images yet, but I wanted the UI in place so I can expand on it later. The share button didn't respond at first because the signal wasn't connected. I had renamed the node earlier, so I had to reconnect the signal manually. I added a return button that sends the player back to the main dress-up game scene. This lets them tweak the outfit or start fresh without resetting the whole game. The return button worked, but the outfit didn't always reset correctly. I fixed this by cleaning the outfit data at the start of the wardrobe scene. I also added a menu button that takes the player back to the main menu. This completes the navigation flow between all major scenes. The background music didn't sync correctly when the scene switches. Sometimes the mute icon didn't match the actual audio state. I fixed this by connecting the buttons to the global music manager so the audio stays consistent everywhere. To keep everything consistent with the rest of the game, I added a fade out transition when switching scenes. The fade out overlay appeared behind the UI instead on top. I had to move it into a higher canvas layer so it always renders above everything. I tested the for loop for the first time. It starts with menu, then to wardrobe, then to finish scene, back to wardrobe, then to menu. Seeing the game flow smoothly from start to finish felt unreal. It finally felt like an actual completed game. Some outfit items didn't carry over correctly the first time. I fixed this by updating the global outfit data before switching scenes.
Huh?
With the sub-viewport, save and share buttons, transitions, and navigation all working, the finished scene is complete, and the game finally has a full playable loop. And that's everything for this episode. In part 10, I'll be polishing the game, fixing small issues, cleaning up the UI, and preparing everything for testing. If you enjoyed this series, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.